Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by the fantastic Eric Petersen to talk all about the AMC series Kevin Can Fuck Himself. And I thought it was such an interesting character because you're playing a character who's a real person in a sitcom setting. And so there's a lot of different layers and nuances to what that could potentially look like in terms of the tone of your performance. So what were the early conversations that you had with Valerie Armstrong, who's the creator of the show, and the rest of the creative team to really figure out tonally what does Kevin need to be in the setting of this show for it to work and to execute everything that we're achieving?
Yeah. So in my first meeting with Valerie at my first audition, I'd received the script and I was like, oh, this is a great title. Obviously, the title grabs you right off the bat. And then I was like, oh, to play a character who is this person who can go fuck himself. Let's see what this is. And obviously, the show goes back and forth between the multicam sitcom world and then the gritty realism of single cam. And but when I went in, I knew I have a deep love of sitcoms, and I've studied them. I've taught them. I've taught sitcom acting before at colleges and stuff. I've done a lot of multicam work, so it was important to me that we weren't going to make a show that was really hating on sitcoms. It wasn't going to be like a parody of sitcoms. And Valerie, from the first instance, was like, absolutely not. I love multicam sitcom as well. We just want to shake it up and really point out the flaws within it. But we're not trying to be like, oh, we should never make multicams again. But there are obviously problems in the form and with the writing of a lot of classic sitcoms, and maybe not even classic ones, but ones that are on the air for a long time. And so once she said, we're not trying to make a parody of a sitcom. We want to make a really good, basically CBS sitcom and have that totally encapsulated in itself. And then we're just going to follow Allison, obviously, into her real life whenever she's not with Kevin. So that was my first thought and discussion with her, that I was like, this is great. We're on the same page. Because as I said, having done a lot of multicam, I was like, I can then just give a true multicam performance and then let the single camera stuff do what they're going to do. And if I do my job of being as honest in, not only honest as an actor, but honest into what a real multicam would look and feel and sound like, tempo, rhythms, how broad and how big I'm going to get with some of the comedic choices and physical comedy choices. If I stay really honest into what would be on a CBS, ABC multicam sitcom, then the show really can work. And I think that we've achieved that.
Yeah. And you mentioned before you're teaching, and you were actually in the midst of teaching multicam to a group of acting students when you got the call for this show. And when you're teaching a class specifically on multicam, what do you find are the specific aspects that it asks of you performance wise that you have to bring in that you don't necessarily have to for single cam?
Yeah, the big thing is tempo and rhythm. Multicam is so musical and really, frankly, mathematic, and it's it has to feel set up, joke, and you can't usually have more than 2 or 3 lines without a laugh line. And so obviously there are some jokes that are written very clearly as here's the joke, but then there's other times where you have to sort of just fill a moment with something that may not be as obvious as here's the punchline, but you have to just give a turn to something that just makes it feel oh, the audience could laugh at that. Because if they sit too long without laughing, then it feels whoa, something's wrong. I did a it was a CBS pilot a few years back, and James Burrows, the classic multicam director of Cheers and Will and Grace and Friends and a bajillion things, was directing this pilot. And I saw him do this thing that I thought was so cool. Once we were on tape night, he had already directed, and everybody was staged where they were going to go. But once we were in the actual shooting of the show, he would walk down to one of the darker sets. If we were shooting the scene in the living room set, he'd walk down to the kitchen set where there's no lights on right then because we're not shooting in that scene, and he would just listen to the scene because he's like, I don't need to watch where they're going. I assume these are professional actors. They're going to know, hit their marks, stand where we have talked about. But what he's listening to is for the rhythm and the timing and how the jokes are landing just to the ear. It's not even really about what you're doing physically or where you're at in the scene. It's just about that sound of here's the line, and there's the joke. And so there's obviously learning those tempos and getting comfortable in those tempos, because they can feel fake when you're in them. Especially if you've done a lot of more realistic single cam acting, it can feel like, whoa, why are we like saying lines almost a little slower? You have to like cut out the pauses between lines, but in your lines, you have to be very deliberate about what you're saying. Everything is very deliberate in multicam, physically, vocally, everything you're doing. So we talk about that. We talk about triplets and like how does the joke work, and can you get a fourth laugh if you're, or a fourth beat if you're getting like setup joke, and then the topper, and then maybe a third topper. So all that stuff is really interesting to me, and that's the type of stuff that I would teach in the multicam class.
I love it. I feel like you just shared like a mini masterclass in multicam.
Yeah, totally.
And you were talking before about the necessity for the show to work, for it never to cross over into being a parody. But when you look at the character that you're playing, there are performance elements that have to be a little bit exaggerated for it to work as well. So was there a dance at all in figuring out how far and how exaggerated you could push certain choices without it ever crossing over into parody? Or did you find it easy to feel out what that line was?
Yeah, I never felt, I hope that we never went in the like comedy choices. I don't think we ever went too far in going into like a parody world. The parts where we had to sort of dance on the line was when I had the sort of like really cutting lines that were the lines that obviously are informing a lot of the stuff in the single cam. When Kevin is being just sort of dismissive of Allison, he's just playing his truth. Whenever he's doing, hijinks or schemes with Neil and Pete, we're really just playing those pretty straight. But there are those moments, in the pilot, there's a line where I say, like, she's bleeding from the hand, and I say, like, oh, you don't get to be moody. You already used that excuse once this month, which is like a terrible line and a terrible thing to say to anyone, let alone your wife. And so like those moments when we had those sort of like cutting lines that really informed the rest of the show, that was finding like a nice tightrope of walking, of being like, it has to be a little meaner than you maybe would see if I was really trying to protect, like, oh, this, he wouldn't say this to his wife, but he would. And sadly, there are lines that are pretty darn close to that in sitcoms that you've seen on TV. So that was those moments of the sort of like really cutting, terrible, dastardly lines that he has to say to Allison. That's where we were, I remember there was a day where they like brought in some new line, and they're like, all right, let's try this line. And I was like, oh, there's no way the audience will fucking hate me. Like, if I say this, they will hate me. And they did. And like, I can't remember what it was, but it was worse than that line about like, you don't get to be moody. And as soon as I said it, the audience was like, oh, because we didn't have a full audience because of COVID. But we did have this group of like, I think it was like 10 to 15 laughers that they brought in from local Boston people that got paid, a day's wage for something. And they would sit behind this curtain, and they all were all masked up and sitting 6 feet apart and watching on a monitor. And it was nice to have that, because doing multicam is very, very much like doing a play or a theater performance. And you have to have that immediate response, because if you do those jokes to just silence, it will kill you as an actor, and it will just kill your artistic soul. So I was so glad that they, at least, when we couldn't have a full live audience, they at least brought in this small group to have something. But even that group, when I would say things that were too mean, they would really kind of turn on me and be like, no, we can't abide by that.
That one particular line, even though I was watching it at home by myself, I think I had a visceral response when you delivered that one. Because
when we shot it, I remember like I said it, and then like the scene ended, and I looked like right into the camera, because I knew that the camera feed was going to this group of laughers. And then they were like, and I was like, oh, happy-go-lucky Kevin. They're like, hey, I was saying this terrible thing to her. And then they said cut, and I was like, I'm sorry, I don't want to say these things, but and then they laughed at that.
But also there's an interesting dynamic for the audience as well, because they don't necessarily know the whole other side of the show that's happening, where Annie's Eddie Murphy's character goes into single cam and, has these
Yes.
fantasies of murdering him. They're not seeing that. They're literally just seeing it delivered as this straight sitcom. And then I also heard that they had a lot of protectiveness over her as well when you would deliver lines, because obviously they know and love her for Schitt's Creek. And were there any
Yes.
moments where they maybe didn't laugh at something, or the response was a little bit different because of their interpretation of what they were sitting and watching because of all of that?
Yeah, I think there's a line, or there was a moment in the eighth episode, our final episode of the first season, where I don't want to give too much away, but I think everybody knows Allison is upset with Kevin. The whole show is about her being upset with Kevin. So yeah, spoiler alert. And so they have a scene where she kind of tells him off to his face and kind of says, like, you're being a real jerk. And what I thought was interesting was, as you said, this group of laughers that we brought in, they were not seeing all the single camera stuff. So a lot of information they didn't know. They didn't know that Kevin has drained the bank account and that he's ruined her career and sabotaged, when she was a paralegal and all these terrible things. They didn't know about that because they weren't seeing the single camera stuff and they weren't given scripts. They were just, asked to laugh at these scenes. And so when we shot that last scene of the last episode, she was like, or not the last scene, but one of the scenes in that last episode, when she was like saying you're a jerk, I felt like they kind of laughed, but it was more almost like, why are you being a jerk to Kevin? We love Kevin. Like, he's not that bad. He's just like a guy. Come on, take it easy on Kevin. And obviously it's hard to totally read what just laughing sounds like, but at least to my perception in that scene, I was shocked that they weren't like, yeah, Allison, tell him. They kind of seemed like, come on, Allison, you're being a little mean. He's just Kevin. He's just like a lovable doofus. And that's, I think, only because they weren't seeing the single camera stuff. And I'm sure that some of them, when they go back and watch the whole season, will probably be like, oh, we should have been rooting more for
cheered
Allison.
Louder against him.
Yeah, I think so.
And then as the episodes start to progress, you have Annie going out into single cam world as Allison. And like you said, there's all those details plot wise and story wise. And then she does start bringing a little bit of her self-assertiveness into the multicam setting. And there's certain, things that she just drops, a couple lines of dialogue or a reaction to something that he says, that are different as we progress further in the season. Was it important to you to be very conscious of which moments to just not respond to, because he also doesn't have the context of everything that's going on outside there, and he doesn't know that she knows all of these things as well?
Yeah, I actually didn't. I sort of purposely didn't change my performance throughout because of that, because I think it's important to keep focused on the fact that Kevin really literally only cares about himself. That's it. And full stop. All he cares about is himself. And that's why he's a terrible husband and a terrible man, And I sort of didn't, I think you see at times he gets a little like, what are you talking back to me for? Like, this isn't our banter. I say something, you laugh, you say, oh, Kevin, and then you walk away. And when she starts to get a little tougher with me, I try not to let it affect me too much, but there are like little moments of just sort of maybe a glance of like, well, that's odd that she said that. But he's so self-involved that he has no capacity to, dissect that and figure out like, oh, maybe what I said is upsetting her and I should change my behavior. That's not on his radar at all. He really is so in his own world and thinks that everyone around him is just there to fulfill his wants, his needs, whatever scheme he's up to. And that's not just Allison. I mean, frankly, that's how he views his dad. That's how he views Neil. That's how he views Patty. Like, he really is just so self-involved. And I think that's, if you look at, classic sitcom husbands, Archie Bunker, Ralph Cramden, Tim Allen, Tim Taylor on Home Improvement, like, they really are just, they're so in their own lane. They have no concept of other people living lives around them.
And obviously with that, the entire sitcom setup within the show is all geared around that exact fact, where he is the star of his own show in his own mind, and everything else revolves around him. And how did that lend itself to a lot of the blocking of scenes and the way that you would, the cameras were tracking everything with it being centered around him, egotistically in his own mind, but also externally a little bit, because these characters do very much revolve around him physically as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it always, I've found myself always sitting in the middle of the couch or standing with people around me, and I was a little bit more down centered, closer to the cameras. Obviously, I was able to do more sort of physical comedy because we're in a multicam, so there's more wider shots, which is fun. I can be a little more bombastic with my arm movements and stuff like that, and everybody just sort of has to, watch out for darting hands as we did scenes.
And then you obviously have all of the production design elements, and they took heed from a lot of very classic and more recent
Yeah,
sitcoms as
isn't it
well.
great though? Oh,
It's
it's so
so
good.
good. Like you look at that rug and you know that you've seen that exact rug in 10 other
Yes,
shows, and that
yes, and
couch where it's
the
just
couch and the
yeah.
staircase. Yeah, oh, totally. The
Did a lot of
wallpaper. Yeah,
did a lot of elements like that, and then even down to the costumes and the outfits that you wear as well, because it's got that kind of, it almost fits but it doesn't quite fit. There's a lot of
yeah,
slogan t-shirts and
yeah,
a lot of Worcester, like I love everything local, and that's kind of very much his mo through his clothes. So how did all of those elements help you in building him as a character?
yeah. So I love clothes. I'm a bit of a fashionista myself. So I will say, and it's so funny because Annie felt this way as well. And she came off of playing Alexis, where she wore these amazing, beautiful costumes, and then on this show she was in like Target shoes and like a t-shirt and just like pants, like just like the most boring stuff. And for me, I was always wearing these like big track jackets and shirts that were too big and big like basketball shorts and stuff, which is, I would just never wear that in life, so it definitely informed. I remember when they showed me the like costume chart of like what they were thinking of examples. Literally every single picture for me was a picture of Adam Sandler in like his real life, because Adam Sandler wears like long basketball shorts and like track jackets everywhere. And I was like, these are all Adam Sandler, even though you couldn't see the face. I was like, I know that's Adam Sandler, and they were like, yeah, they're all Adam Sandler. And so the costumes definitely really informed it. One of the cool things that our costume designer Carol Cutshall had an idea about is that I wear almost a new pair of sneakers in almost every scene. And if not every scene, at least every episode. And they're not like cool sneakers, but they're brand new and really clean. And so it's just a little nod to this idea that Kevin is like spending money on new shoes all the time, and that Allison has no money to buy anything nice or anything like that. So all of those little details really sort of helped me sort of get into this like oafish guy who is obviously super proud of being from Boston and being from Worcester. We tried to get as many little Boston things that we could without, it's hard to clear athletic things for, just for TV, because you have to get approval from the teams. So we got a lot of things that were like generally about Boston sports without actually doing it. One of the things I was happy, I suggested this one shirt that I think is maybe in the third or fourth episode, because I saw it at the mall when I was in Boston, and it says, live each day like it's 27-3, which is when the Patriots were playing the Falcons a couple years ago in the Super Bowl, and then they were losing, but then they came back to win. So like all the people in Boston will love that shirt because it's like a nod to the Patriots, but it didn't say Patriots anywhere on it. So we were able to to wear it without having to get it cleared.
Excellent ingenuity to get around.
Yes, yes, yeah.
It also sounds like they created a lot of kind of in-house rules of this can happen in the multicam universe but can't happen in the single cam universe, and vice versa, and little things like, okay, the show might be called Kevin Can Fuck Himself, but we're not swearing in the multicam because that wouldn't happen in a CBS sitcom, to your point.
Totally.
And what were some of the other rules and specificities that everybody knew were just kind of, even if they were unspoken, this is only going to happen in this world, or this can't happen?
Yeah, so obviously, whenever Kevin or Pete or Neil are around, we're in the multicam, because they always exist in a world that has people laughing at their jokes and cheering them on and saying like, yeah, you're the best. So obviously that's like the main starter rule. Another cool thing that we did, as you said, we don't swear in the multicam because that would never pass standards and practices at CBS. But one of the things that they did that I thought was so cool is, especially as the show progresses and Patty and Allison are really sort of starting to know more about each other and their lives are getting more intertwined. In theory, you could have had a moment while we were in multicam, while I was spouting about some scheme or something like that, that you might do a tight shot on Annie looking at Mary Hollis to be like, oh my gosh, like this has something to do with what we're dealing with outside of this world. But they never did that because it wouldn't make sense in the multicam. So I love that they really made the choice of when we were in the multicam, you literally could take it out of the show and put it on CBS or whatever, and it would all work. There's no like scenes or shots or close-ups of like, oh, well, let's get a response to this because it might be effective. No, it has to exist as if it's a real show.
And then the single cam universe exists, you know, primarily and almost solely with Allison, but there are one or two instances in which we see your character in that setting, but only through the figment of her imagination, like the scene where she imagines what it would be like to stab him in the neck with a shard of glass and he bleeds out. And so when you were filming those scenes, what was the tone that you wanted to find? Because again, you're playing a character who's been in a sitcom universe, going into this darker space, but also a figment of her imagination. So again, there's three different layers to what you're having to do.
Yeah. So like when we would do the, we did literally spend like a whole day of those scenes where she's sort of dressed as like the 50s housewife and she's serving me a beer. I think we literally spent, I must have drank 150 beers that day. Just like, I mean, just a sip of each, but like, they were like, all right, they did times where she looked to the left, times where she looked to the right, times where she was kind of happy, but not totally happy, all these different variations. So for that, I really did try to like tone down, obviously, a lot of the like, I wasn't like, oh, honey, you know, which is maybe a little bit more multicam. I really tried to be like, I'm just happy. I'm happy with you. And this is calm and settled and more grounded. And then, for instance, when we do the scene at the end of the pilot where I'm bleeding out, I tried to, you know, channel my best acting school, you know, training and not play it like, oh my God, I'm blue. How could you, babe? Oh, you stabbed me in the neck. You know, and like I didn't do the big broad thing. I really tried to, you know, almost do nothing because I think if you were stabbed in the neck, you almost have no response other than to just sort of bleed out.
To die.
But what I loved was Alex Bonifer and Brian Howe, who play Neil and Pete respectively. You don't see it too much because just for the way that it was edited, and it makes total sense, but they gave like beautiful performances as I died, you know, being stabbed in the neck. I mean, Brian was specifically, Alex as well, but just, I mean, he was weeping, tears were streaming down his face. He's like, what did you do to my boy? And he was like, really, it was like, it was spectacular. When we watched it back, I was like, Brian, my God, that was like really emotional. Because obviously when we're in that single camera world, we tried to really ground it and really kind of honor that art form.
And with multicam performance as well, there's also a lot of physical elements to the comedy which come with that. And those are very often aspects of a performance that you find once you're on set and once you're filming things, because a lot of it is discovered off the page. And you were talking earlier about how even, you know, he would wave his arms around a lot because then that forces other people to move around his personal space. And there's things like the scene where you're moisturizing your leg and you know, you flip the moisture over towards Annie. And so when you were figuring out a lot of those physical beats in scenes, what was kind of the behind the scenes process in a lot of that?
Well, luckily I loved that they sort of gave me a lot of license in that stuff. I love doing physical comedy. I fancy myself a bit of a aficionado at it. So, you know, like in the scene with the moisturizer, the like flicking my foot, that was like my idea. And what I love though is Annie is obviously so funny. And she didn't get to do a ton of physical comedy stuff in the multicam purposefully, but I loved creating the bits with her. You know, like I was like, oh, maybe I could sort of like flick my foot. She's like, yes, it'll like go in my eye, and I can, you know. So that was honestly some of my favorite moments of the whole season, was creating those physical bits for the multicam stuff. You know, there's a scene in episode 3 where I flip a spoon of chili like right onto her face. And we were very proud of ourselves because they kept saying, I'm holding this big pig. And then the idea is that I like sort of drop the pig and there's a spoon with chili on it and it sort of hits the edge and then sprays on her. And they were like, obviously that's like impossible to do. So we'll just sort of get a shot of you sort of like dropping the pig. And then we'll do a cut shot to, you know, we'll set it up and we can aim it perfectly. And I was like, just give me a chance. Let me just try it once without, you know, where you can stay wide. And they were like, okay, you can try. And me and Annie like figured out exactly where we needed to be. and it worked perfectly. And it like was the best. And it's the shot that's in the show. And I like took the pig and I sort of dropped it and it hit the spoon perfectly. The chili went flying and it literally went like on her face, on her nose, on her cheek, on her dress, hit the ceiling. It like was, we talked about it for weeks. We were like, do you remember when we did that pig chili thing? That was awesome. Cause it was, I think nobody thought we'd be able to do it and pull it off. And we did, and it was awesome.
And lastly, a huge kind of goal of the show as a whole, but in particular with your character, is to enhance a lot of critical thinking in audiences about how are we engaging with the content that we're watching? Are we being critical of things that we need to, and stepping back and thinking about the deeper context? And so I was just very interested in what the conversations were behind the scenes about ensuring that everything that you were doing in a lot of these scenes would do that and create that.
Yeah, I think that what I think is interesting is I think obviously a major sort of tone or message of our show is female empowerment and giving women, power over their own choices and their own lives, and owning their lives and their stories, and stepping out and not living in the shadow of the men around them. And so obviously I think a lot of women will totally take to the show and feel seen and heard and feel like this is a show for me. And that's great. And I love that. But one of the things that is important to me, and I think probably, hopefully will happen, is that I think a lot of men will have a real moment of reckoning and of looking in the mirror. Because while the performance that I'm giving is sort of big and broad and oafish, I sadly think it's not super far off from the way that a lot of men feel in their marriages and behave in their homes. Because I think that sitcoms throughout the years have been this sort of toggling between reflective of the times and also maybe challenging the times. And I think that, for a sitcom to work, it has to feel somewhat natural to the audience. The audience has to feel, especially in marriage, couple sitcoms, that when you're watching it with your wife prior to our show, you should feel like, oh yeah, that's us. Yeah, oh, that's us. I'm a little dumb, and you're always helping me out or whatever. And so that's why they feel familiar, and they feel safe, and they feel happy, and they make you warm inside, and you feel good about them. But I think that once men see the effect of what some of those jokes or some of those behaviors have on the women when they're not in the room with them, I think that a lot of men will sort of maybe look at their wives and be like, shit, I'm sorry. I've done that. I've sort of pretended like, oh, I'm not listening to you because I'm talking to my buddies and we all think it's cute and funny. But then I see how frustrating it makes you when you're not with me. So my big hope is that men will gain a lot of real empathy for the way that their choices and their words and their non-choices or non-engagement in their partner's lives really can affect them, and hopefully give them a deep sense of empathy for their partners.
Well, I hope it does all of that too. And I'm so impressed at the balance and dance of tones that this show has managed to achieve. And thank you so much for talking all about this with us today.
Thank you, Mara.